Good morning. Please welcome Grantmakers Education Board Chairperson, Greg Bear.
The mode, have a seat in the foyer. Take a number. I was lightning before the thunder.
I didn't know I was going to have walk-up music. That's pretty cool. Can I say raise the curtains, give us our view back? So welcome, everyone, to San Diego and to the 2018 Annual Conference for Grantmakers for Education. We are grateful to our generous sponsors for creating this venue for us to come together, to learn together, and to work together to advance issues about which we commonly care so passionately. Thank you to our delegate sponsors, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you to our advocate sponsors. Not me. Thank you to our liaison sponsors, that is me. And thank you to our contributor sponsors. Two of the remarkable people who share our passion are pictured here. Two leaders who invested deeply in leading GFE forward. Today, and in the days ahead, we honor and celebrate our outgoing Executive Director, Anna Tilton, and our outgoing Board Chair, Cristina Hueso. They deserve a second round of applause. Would you help to honor? And walk-up music, too. And in the days ahead, we welcome our new Executive Director, Celine Coggins, someone who similarly cares deeply about supporting all learners. You'll get a chance to hear directly from Celine in this very room on Thursday at 10:30 a.m. And tomorrow, beginning at 5:30, you can meet Celine at a reception to be held in the Cornet Room. Whether at these events or in the hallways, please find a moment to say hello to Celine during your time here in San Diego. As for me, I'm Greg Bear, Executive Director of the Grable Foundation, and as of yesterday, I proudly chair the board for GFE. I look forward to working. Thank you. We have some amazing trustees, and I'm so grateful and excited to work alongside of them and their leadership, and I think all of us should be excited about what's about to unfold. Now, those of you who know me know that I'm a Pittsburgh kid, and I have two hometown heroes, baseball great and humanitarian Roberto Clemente, and children's television icon Fred Rogers. So I can tell by that applause, some of you watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood growing up, and some of you have kids who watch Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, and I hope some of you saw the hit documentary this summer, Won't You Be My Neighbor? So if you did, then you know that Fred Rogers was so much more than a loving and caring host of a television program, so much more than someone who was steeped in childhood development theories and who studied at the University of Pittsburgh with the likes of Benjamin Spock, Eric Erickson, and Margaret McFarland. While not perfect, Fred was a disruptor, a social justice proponent, and an advocate for what is good and what is right. And for me, and for nearly every kid whose life he touched through television screens, he unequivocally communicated, "You belong." With privilege, and amidst privilege, it is our charge to say out loud to all kids everywhere, "You belong." It is our opportunity, as we lift up the hard questions of our times, that our young people hear us say, "You belong." And it is our opportunity to say without question, "You belong, and you belong to the future." Our commitment at GFE is to support you by raising for us all the hard questions about equity and about innovation, so that together we might positively shape the future of public education, and with it, the future for all learners all across America. She belongs to what's now and she belongs to what's next. And you belong. You belong right here in this moment to this community, to GFE. Amidst our alphabet soup of interests, K-12, OST, ECE, SEL, SEAD, ELL, PSE, CCR, CTE, STEM, and beyond. We are all committed to each and every learner and to the person, the professional, and the citizen that she will someday become. As my hero Fred Rogers once said, we live in a world in which we need to share responsibility. It is easy to say, it's not my child, not my community, not my world, not my problem. Then there are those who see need and respond. I consider those people my heroes. To everyone in this room this morning, we thank you for being heroes to the rising American generation. And as we endeavor together to support all learners wholly, I am pleased to welcome to the stage this morning Junlei Li, Luma Mufleh, and Libia Gil, who will illuminate the core of whole learner education in research and in practice. First, please welcome Dr. Junlei Li.
Good morning. So whenever I travel, no matter where I go, I always kind of ask myself, why am I here? And my work is pretty far from grant making. I have very little to do with that. Most of my work are with who I call, or Mr. Rogers call, helpers. So anyone who's involved in working directly with children kind of anywhere in the world. And our work is actually really simple. So we would go to where the helpers are, whether they're on a street corner or in a village in China, and we would try to capture what they do day in and day out in the most mundane, ordinary moments of the day. And then we would share these very same moments, right, in video form, and we would reflect that back to those who work there. And we would ask them, kind of, what do you see in your own work? And that's about it. And we would do that over and over and over again. So most of these workshops go quite well because it's kind of nerve-wracking for people to see themselves, but then people are interested to see themselves and see what other people's work would be like within their same community. But there was always something unsatisfying at the end of these workshops and learning sessions, because invariably, at the very end, right, one person, at least one person, would say something to the effect that, you know who needs to be at this workshop? They need to be at this workshop. And they don't often name who the they are, but the people around the room would just nod. Right? And then over time we realized almost everyone have a they. Right? And so anyhow, a few days ago when I was thinking about coming to this conference, it just dawned on me that this is the they conference. And I think behind the term they, right, is the notion that the helpers who work on the front lines working with children and so on, they sometimes feel a disconnect. And by disconnect, I mean that on one hand, right, there are those who have the decision power and the voice and the stage to define what high quality work is like. Right? And they may be researchers, funders, policymakers, administrators, and so on. And then so many of our helpers work in very low resource settings, or at least low access to resources, that they couldn't identify with the definitions of high quality on one end. And the gap between them is what we are struggling with in terms of equity, right? Our inability to close that. And part of when people say, I wish they could be there to hear it, that's this idea that I wish they can come and see what quality means where I work. So what I thought this morning, what I'd like to try to do is maybe to just take a real quick kind of around the world trip, right, to places that we typically would consider low resources, at least have low access to resources. Right? We'll start in the place where a lot of our work started, a small village on the eastern part of China. It's a unique kind of a place. The village was tiny, 2 streets, 800 families, but within that village there are about 200 foster care children. They were children with moderate to severe disabilities that had been abandoned into the orphanage system, and when the orphanage system are overcrowded, they are then sent to the village. And the farmers became their foster parents and later their therapists and teachers and so on. What I'd like to just show you just briefly is 30 seconds of what their preschool is like. So just for a second, if you could humor me for a second, if you could just all close your eyes just for a little bit of quiet. If you could just let that moment replay in your mind's eye. And when you're done, you can open your eyes. I just wanted you to have a moment to check kind of what is it that hits you, right, about that moment. Now, I'm assuming that most of you don't understand Chinese, but I don't think that matters, right? Judging by the reaction, there's something about this you connect with. And I would love to hear kind of what each of you see, but I'm going to make a bet that the things you will say are going to be the same kind of things that the farmers said when they saw videos of their own work. It's going to center around 4 kind of things that give us a good feeling about a human interaction. 1, a sense of connection. You can call it by any other name, but people feel connected. A sense of interaction or reciprocity or serve and return, right? Whatever's happening seems to be going back and forth, not just one directional. A sense of inclusion, that regardless of your ability is high or low, regardless of what you're able to do or not able to do, you're somehow part of this. You kind of belong. And that even in 30 seconds, you can probably see just the inklings of the opportunities that each child have to grow in some way. Now I'm going to just transport you back to the United States, and we're going to go to an outskirts of Atlanta, and we're going to go to one of those what I call middle-of-the-road child care centers, right? Not the highest rated, not the lowest, just kind of middle of the road. And this is going to go on for about 3 minutes or so, so some of you might feel like, oh, that's going to be a while. But just imagine this is your site visit, right? If you could just get on the floor and sit on the infant toddler room, right? And just for 3 minutes, and using whatever lens you have, just to be there for 3 minutes.
Go. You making bubbles? You making bubbles? Here, get your car.
Kimmy's on the way.
Hey, you gonna play cards with us? You gonna play cards with us? Here comes the boss. Kim's gonna play with us. You gonna play with us? There you go. There you go. High five. High 10. High 10. High 10. There you go. High 10. 10. High 10. 10. There you go. I got a double high 10. I'm sorry. I didn't go too quick. I'm sorry. Where we going? Where we going? You went back down? You come back up? Making music. You gonna dance to it? Oh! 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 You held yours longer than me. Thank you. Oh. You got no more left? You got no more left? Hey, girl, what you doing, girl? What you doing, girl? Thank you, girl.
So thank you. Thank you for taking 3 minutes on the floor with them. And you go from China back to Atlanta, and when you look at that moment, right, I think you can see the same kind of dimensions, right? I mean, just replay just briefly, like what was the connection there? What was the reciprocity there? Not just for all three, but for each of them, right? And how that reciprocity was different depending on which child. These three children, physically, language, right, very different, but somehow they're all part of her sphere. And then there's some opportunity to grow, right, for each of them in the way that suited the child. And one of the things I always struggled with as a researcher is that most of the settings in which we work with, you can see these moments, right? But then you have all these binders with which you are to score them, right? And if you can picture kind of a rural orphanage in China, there's no binder that could give them a high score. But then what I was measuring and what I was seeing was incongruent. And I think we then struggle with kind of this challenge that researchers and grant makers and policymakers struggle with all the time, that what counts cannot always be counted, and what can be counted doesn't always count. And I think eventually, for me, it made sense when I thought of our work with children as kind of a tube of toothpaste. I was reading the back of my children's toothpaste, and there's this term called active ingredient, which I've heard in research as well. For the toothpaste, it's sodium fluoride. So I remember asking myself, like, if our work with children is like a tube, then what's the active ingredient for us? And what if the research is right, that it is in fact having something to do with the quality of human interactions? Now, early on, I thought, oh, that just means human interaction is important. Everyone knows that. But then there's something meaningful about the word active ingredient. So when you think about it in the toothpaste, right, you can have bubblegum flavor. That doesn't prevent cavity. The fluoride does. But the bubblegum flavor works because it helps the children to hold it in their mouth for 2 minutes so the fluoride could work. So everything else inside a toothpaste is helpful if and only if it actually helps the active ingredient. And you take out the active ingredient, nothing else really mattered that much. What if that's how human relationships work? And what if we can think of kind of this gap, right, that we can possibly close it by identifying where these active ingredients are present, even in places that doesn't score well, even in places that we traditionally consider to be low resources. Because the one resource, even in that little village in China they have, are people. And where there are people, there are possibilities for interactions. And we have seen them in the low-income public schools in Pittsburgh. We've seen these kind of interaction about 5 hours north of here this summer in the out-of-school time programs outside some of the largest migrant labor camps in Central Valley. We've seen it in the School for the Deaf, where communication relationship building itself is constrained by abilities and disabilities, or in the Children's Hospital, where the stress of health issues impede, or on the street corners in Pittsburgh with the crossing guards, where all they have is about 5 seconds time to interact with the child, or in Edmonton, Canada, in the residential boys' ranch, where the children doesn't belong with school or family and have been placed there. And that in each of those places, these same things that pop up over and over and over again. And that reminded of us that it is possible, if we set our eyes on the active ingredient, it is possible in real time to finally count the kind of things that could actually be counted. Not just in numbers, but just by noticing and by being able to describe it. What does this mean in the context of our collective work? What does it mean if we think of human interactions as the active ingredient? All of us are here in every session. We're thinking about matters that impacts practice, program, and policy. And I venture to say that any kind of practice, program, and policy would work for children if and only if it can encourage, enrich, and empower the human interactions around the child. And that then makes this question perhaps the single most important question when we think about practice, program, and policies. And this is a test to which we ought to subject every one of our decisions to. How does this thing that we're talking about help to encourage, enrich, and empower the human interactions around the child? And what then follows is that children do not have interactions in a vacuum. They have it with the helpers around them. And that whether it is based on common sense or science, it is true that we cannot make a lasting impact on children by skipping over the adults in the middle. But what does it mean to not to skip the adults in the middle then? I think it meant to be able to honor, to recognize, to be able to spend 3 minutes on the floor to see what the mundane and ordinary moments are like when the helpers are doing their work. And it means to offer to the helpers what they try to offer to the children. What does it mean to connect, to be present, to see and hear a helper, to be reciprocal, to include even the helpers with limited credentials, and to think about how helpers grow themselves. In short, to do for the helpers what we imagine the best helpers do for children and for families. Greg talked about Mr. Rogers. So about, let's say, 16 years ago, almost exactly, Fred gave one of his final public addresses to the Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families, a body that's very similar to who we have here. And he summed up not only his message for those who are in philanthropy, but his message throughout his entire lifetime's work. That the most important philanthropy arises from the deepest level of our being. Every one of us on this planet longs to know that there's something about us that's worth giving. And those who work as helpers, they need reminders that every little thing they do in the most mundane, ordinary moments are worth giving. And that the next time I'm doing a workshop somewhere in the world with the helpers, and at the end of the workshop, if the question comes up, that they say, well, you know who needs to hear it, I love to be able to say, oh, they know. They know, they see you, they hear you, they know. Thank you.
Good morning, or good afternoon if you're from the East Coast. My daughters are still having a hard time about the amount of travel I've been doing. My 4-year-old tried to pack herself in the suitcase and was promising to sit quietly while I spoke, and I reminded her she never sits quietly while I speak. My 3-year-old, when I asked her, hey, come give me a hug, she said, go hug yourself. My students, on the other hand, took it very differently. Yesterday, when I was trying to explain to them that I was coming out to California for a conference and that I will be out most of the week, Abhishek from Nepal tried to tag along, insisting that he could give a worthy dance performance. And Zainab from Iraq said that she could talk to people about our school instead of me. When I said I was speaking to almost 500 people in the room, the whole room went silent at the all-refugee school that I founded, and they gasped. You're a very brave, coach, said one of them. No, I responded, I'm very nervous. My work is personal, so let me take a step back to 1964. My grandmother escaped Syria that year during the Assad regime. 3 months pregnant, she packed up a suitcase, piled in her 5 children, and drove to neighboring Jordan, not knowing what the future held for her and her family. My grandfather stayed behind, not believing it was that bad. He joined her a month later after his brothers were tortured and his factory was taken over by the government. They rebuilt their lives in Jordan, starting from scratch, and eventually became independently wealthy Jordanian citizens. I was born in Jordan 11 years later, but my grandmother wanted me to understand my family's history and journey. When I was 8, she took me to visit my first refugee camp. I remember not wanting to go, not understanding why. I was shocked by the environment of the refugee camp. I had led a pretty sheltered life, not knowing how others lived. And as an 8-year-old, I hid behind her leg, not wanting to go out of my comfort zone. She said, go play with the kids, while she visited with the women in the camp. I refused. These kids were poor, they lived in a camp, they weren't like me. I didn't want to. She knelt down next to me and firmly said, go, and don't come back until you've played. Don't ever think people are beneath you, and don't think you have nothing to learn from others. I reluctantly went. I never wanted to disappoint my grandmother. I returned later, having spent a few hours playing soccer with the kids in the camp. We walked out together, holding hands. I was excitedly telling her how much fun I had and how great these kids were. Haram, I said in Arabic. Pour them. Haram on us, my grandmother said, using the words different meaning, that we were sinning. Don't feel sorry for them, believe in them. It wasn't until I left my country of origin for the United States that I realized the impact of her words. During the spring of my senior year, as my classmates were finishing up applications to grad schools and going on job interviews, I was going on a different kind of interview. I was preparing for my asylum hearing. I'd made the decision to seek asylum in the United States based on the well-founded fear of persecution because of membership in a social group. In case you haven't figured out, I'm gay. I'm also Arab and Muslim. In soccer, we call it a hat trick. Today, I don't know what we call it. Those 3 things generally don't go well together. In the Middle East, you can get the death penalty for being gay, and honor killings are still very prevalent. After my years at Smith, I knew that I could never go back to Jordan. I had the confidence, the friendships, and the certainty that that was the best decision for me. That summer, I was granted asylum. I was no longer on the path that had been chosen for me. I was disowned by my family, and I hadn't applied for jobs or grad schools because my future was so uncertain my senior year, but I had my freedom. After bouncing around jobs, temping, not really feeling like I belonged in Boston, I decided to move to Highlands, North Carolina. One of my classmates at Smith had an aunt who owned a restaurant there, and she was always looking for help. My friends were very skeptical about my moving south. What was a gay Arab Muslim going to do in the South? Despite their concerns, I packed up all my belongings in the duffel bag and headed south. Miss Sarah Lee, yes, that's her real name, welcomed me to her home. She was a Southern Baptist, a cross between Blanche from the Golden Girls and Julia Sugarbaker from Designing Women. I would work 3 shifts at her restaurants. I did everything from washing dishes to cooking to waiting tables. I couldn't feel my legs after my 14-hour days. I learned the value of hard work, of nothing being beneath me. Miss Sarah was a hard worker and she led by example. I was nervous about coming out to her. I remember sitting in her living room. Miss Sarah, you know that I'm gay. Her response is one that I will never forget. That's fine, honey, just don't be a slut. She made me feel like I had a home, but something would not allow me to stay put there. It was time to move on. I knew I wanted to stay in the South, close to Miss Sarah and her family, but in a place that had more to offer. So a week before my 24th birthday, I moved to Atlanta, an hour and a half south of Highlands. I began waiting tables as soon as I got there. I was also clerking for a law firm, thinking that's what I wanted to go into. I got a job doing web and graphic design and eventually opened up a cafe. And looking back now, it was things I was interested in. I could have been good at them, but I wasn't passionate about any of them. I think on some level I was trying to prove to my family back in Jordan that I could do it on my own, but I was trying to fit into their definition of success. Then one day on a drive I'd taken many times to Clarkston, Georgia, to a Middle Eastern grocery store that I frequented, I made a wrong turn into an apartment complex, and I saw some kids playing soccer. They're outside their apartments in the parking lot, playing barefoot with rocks set up as goals and arguing. I watched these kids play, and they reminded me of home, of the way I played soccer in the streets of Jordan with my brothers and cousins. I also realized they're all refugees from war-torn nations, all trying to assimilate and make a life for themselves in this country. I decided I wanted to play with them, so I came out later in the week, armed with a ball. One of the boys ran up to me and asked if he could use the ball because it was in better condition than the one they had. I asked to play in return. The boys were skeptical about letting me, a woman, and a stranger join the game. So they got in a huddle, and finally one of them said, "Okay, you're on their team." Of course, I got the chubby kid and the really small one, but it didn't matter. I hadn't had that much fun in a long time. We argued about goals, we played barefoot and sweated. We played for over an hour. I played with the boys a few more times over the next few weeks. I gradually won them over. According to them, girls don't know how to play soccer, but obviously I did. I asked them if they'd ever played on a team. They said no, but that they would love to. Nothing prepared me for what I was getting into. Very quickly, my worrying about whether I was charging enough for a latte at the cafe seemed inconsequential, particularly in the larger scheme of the daily struggles the kids and their families faced. 7 months later, I closed my cafe and filed for bankruptcy, realizing that my world was changing. That was the second time I hit rock bottom. At the age of 29, I had failed miserably by any measure. The path of the American dream was nowhere in sight. Maybe my parents were right, that there was no way I could make it without their support. The Fugees, which we eventually named ourselves, wasn't a typical soccer team. The kids were from war-torn countries like Bosnia, Liberia, Sudan, and Afghanistan. The Fugees grew from 1 team to 2 to 3. The older siblings of the original Fugees would come and say, "Coach, we want to be Fuji." So we grew. I never had an incredible plan of what to do. The kids and their families taught me what was needed. They showed me that you can't survive on minimum wage in this country. They showed me the racism and classism in this country and how ugly it can be. They showed me the disparity in educational opportunity. And most of all, they showed me it was far from okay. My kids are set up for failure from day one because they're put in the age-appropriate class even though they have had no formal schooling. They're expected to function without having learned the basics, to take algebra classes even though they can't add, to study Shakespeare when they can't read. They get passed through the system so that they won't be a burden. They show us everything that is wrong with our current educational system. When I stepped in and did something, I didn't have a master plan. I started off playing pickup soccer in a parking lot and ended up starting the first school for refugees in the country. I formed an organization and a private school that would treat the kids and their families like first-class citizens that they are, that would give them the education that they were robbed of. A few years ago, I was in my office, and a new 12-year-old student who had just entered our 6th grade class, he was frustrated, angry, and defeated. He had been at the local elementary school, and they had just promoted him to the 6th grade. He had failed the standardized test, but the letter from the district said, after careful discussion and review of your child's achievement, CRCT, ITBS, and other test scores, progress reports, and report cards for the 2013-14 school year, a unanimous decision was made to place Emmanuel in the 6th grade. Emmanuel knew 9 letters of the alphabet. His mom had come to us at the beginning of the summer asking us to please take him. With the help of an interpreter, she told me that he was always in trouble at school and that he regularly got into fights. I tried to explain that we were not taking any new students, that we didn't have any space in the building, and that we couldn't raise enough money to take him in. No, you can, please. What can I do? I can pay. How much? Just tell me. $8,500. The room went silent. I can cook, clean, I can pay $100. I knew she was a single mom who had fled the war in the Congo, a conflict that had seen child soldiers, sexual violence used as a weapon of war, and armed conflict for control of resources. The DRC is known as the most dangerous place to be a woman and a mother. I knew that she had 6 other kids at home. I knew that her 18-year-old son had dropped out of school to help support the family. And I knew Emmanuel would just be another statistic if we didn't take him in. So we took him in. Over the last 10 years, I have been relentlessly trying to pursue a sustainable funding path for our school. Running a private school for refugee kids that live below the poverty line has its own set of issues, one of them being tuition. I fundraise every day to make sure that the kids get the quality education that they deserve. But as we grow and the numbers get bigger, the budget gets larger, and that becomes increasingly difficult. 4 years ago, we applied to be a charter school. We were rejected for a number of reasons. 1, an existing private school cannot convert to a charter. 2, we cannot serve a specified population. And 3, we'd have to teach state standards. The kids I work with come to this country with no formal schooling. We've created an environment, a curriculum, and a program that works for them and their families, yet we do not fit in the charter school model. At one of the meetings, a woman said, "I'm not going to approve a school that discriminates against middle-class white kids." And so we went to option 2. We tried to contract out with the school district to provide the educational resources for our kids. For 6 months, we were told they were working on it. We provided other contracts with school districts from other parts of the country. For 6 months, nothing happened. The school district decided it was going to initiate a study to see how it can better serve refugee students and could not contract us out because they had never done that. That was over 2 years ago. The study still hasn't happened. The graduation rate for English language learner students is a staggering 26%. I was discouraged. I didn't know what else to do. This option seemed like the best one. It was reasonable. It was a win-win for everyone involved, but the district refused because, again, we didn't fit into a box. So that forced us into option 3, changing the law. The board rallied, the staff mobilized, and the kids got involved. We spent the bulk of January and February meeting with different legislators. After explaining everything to them, introducing them to our kids, our first test was the House Sub-Education Committee. My students were invited to testify. Their voices were heard. Minani from Burundi shared his experience during the first day of school in the United States. On the first day of school here in the US, I felt isolated because I was different and new. I knew no English. The only word I knew was yes. I answered everything yes, and that got me into trouble. I was scared because I couldn't explain myself. I couldn't defend myself because I didn't know the language. Sometimes I would just cry because I felt weak and knew nothing about this new place. Samira from Afghanistan shared this. Being a refugee doesn't mean that you go to a country for fun, but it means that you have been through a lot of hard things, such as being in a war, not having food to eat, not having jobs, and not having a home to live in. Around 1990, the terrorists attacked my country, Afghanistan. When I was born, the terrorists almost reached the capital. My family was traveling state to state. We even traveled to Pakistan in order for my family to find a job. I remember my mom and my elder brother telling me the things the Taliban did. They raped ladies and boys, they burned people's houses, and they killed a lot of women. The women in my country were unlucky. After the Taliban raped them, they would cut off their breasts. Taliban also boiled the men in a large pot while they were alive. It is because of the Taliban that we are here, and we are here as a refugee. We are here to become something so later we can help people around the world. The bill passed unanimously out of committee. Same thing happened in the Rules Committee. and then it went to a floor vote. I was nervous. For a state that had a reputation for not being the most welcoming to newcomers, this was a great turn. It passed the House 155 to 16. The local political predictor put its chances of passing at 70%. We were overjoyed. We could grow our school, serve our kids, and stop worrying about keeping the lights on. We celebrated too early. The chair of the Senate Education Committee had an issue with the bill and wanted to sit down and talk about it. The Department of Education was brought in, and we sat down to discuss. Anytime an issue came up, we were willing to compromise. First, it was the funding formula. The DOE said if we agreed to a flat per student fee, it would be easier for them to administer it. We agreed. Then it was about oversight. The DOE assured the senator that there was a lot of oversight, everything from reports to tracking students' progress to unscheduled site visits. The senator was grasping at anything. He then said, I don't think they should be able to qualify for this forever. I agree, I responded. I sent you the studies that show it takes 6 to 10 years for someone to be academically proficient in a language. So why don't we say 7 years? No, that's way too long. How about 5 years? Still too long. 3? The senator leaned back in his chair, put his hands behind his back, and said, I think it takes 1 year to learn a language. I was dumbfounded. Sir, we sent you the studies. I don't believe in those studies. In the middle of this, he turned to me and out of nowhere said, you know, Muslims kill Christians every day. He refused to give us a hearing. In this process, I have been attacked from all sides. A blogger accused me of running a school for Muslim terrorists. A prominent conservative pundit attacked us by saying if this bill was to pass, then Georgia would be a federal dumping ground for refugees. And a left-wing Democrat said I was being used by the conservatives to get universal vouchers passed. And someone else said that we were a CIA training center. Nothing like uniting the left and the right. In all this, it was never about the kids. What was best for them and their families was never what this was about. I started this school because of the kids. I believed that we could do better than what was being done. I believed that here in the United States, we could welcome people that have experienced horrendous atrocities and forced out of their homes and help them heal and build a new life for themselves. I believe in the American dream. To me, starting the school was the most logical thing to do. I didn't think it was a big risk. I didn't think people would oppose it or feel threatened by it, but I was wrong. This past year has been particularly tough, to say the least. On top of everything that we have had to deal with, the rise in anti-refugee sentiment has made this past year more difficult than others. I try to protect my kids when I can. I don't want them to see more hatred and ignorance than what they've already experienced, but sometimes I can't. Last year, Isa, a 13-year-old from Syria, had a panic attack in art class. He was crying and convulsing. His art teacher was worried and confused as he didn't understand what was going on, and Isa was only speaking in Arabic. We brought Isa up to my office. He was sobbing and saying, "They are all dead, they are dead, I want to be dead." His family members in Syria, including his grandmother, were all killed in a bombing in the village the night before. Let's call your parents and take you home. Sorry. You don't need to be in school today. No, I don't want to go home. I just want to be here. I am safe here. Can I just lay on your couch? Of course, we spoke. We spoke throughout the rest of the day as Asa grieved and cried some more. And at 3:30, he got off the couch and asked to practice with the older students. Of course, I said. When I took him home that night, I walked him to his door to offer my condolences to his family. Allah yarhamhun, may God bless their souls, I said in Arabic, the equivalent of I am sorry for your loss. His mom and I just looked at each other. What do you say to someone who has just lost her mother to a horrific bombing, knowing that she won't be able to go to the funeral and bury her mother? She finally spoke. We are lucky. We are the luckiest that we are here and that we are alive. On the days when I'm defeated, I'm kept in check by my 4-year-old, the one who wanted to get in the suitcase. My daughter, Layla, reminds me every day why I need to do this work. She is privileged. Yes, even being the daughter of a Jewish-Muslim gay couple makes her privileged. At the age of 4, she's been exposed to more words, art, and experiences than 99% of her zip code. She will have options, choices, and opportunities. She never has to worry about where her next meal is coming from. The only decision she won't be making is what soccer team she is rooting for. Joking aside, a few months ago, some of the Fugees were over. We were hanging out, and one of them asked why Layla had all these books in her nursery, because she couldn't read. I explained that it was important to read to babies at a very young age, to speak to them, to expose them to new things. One of the students tried reading to her and saw her turn the pages with him. He looked at me and said, matter-of-factly, by second grade, she will be smarter than all of us. I will do everything I can to give Layla the best opportunities. She is, after all, my daughter. But I'll also do everything I can to close the gap between her and the kids in my community. These experiences leave me more determined. After not being able to secure sustainable funding for our school and having to do layoffs for the first time in our organizational history, I hit rock bottom. That summer, 2 of my former players died, one in a drug deal gone bad, and another committed suicide. I'd written up my resignation letter. I was done. But when I thought about standing up in front of my school and explaining to the students that I could no longer do this work, I realized I couldn't. I didn't need to quit. I needed to get better at what I was doing. I needed to not feel sorry for myself or my students, but to truly believe in us. 3 years later, we have graduated 3 cohorts of students, all of them the first in their families to graduate from middle school, high school, and enroll in college. My team of students, parents, board, staff, and faculty are as strong as they have ever been, deeply committed to leveling the playing field. This fall, we opened our 2nd campus in Columbus, Ohio, and next year we'll open our 3rd in Cleveland. Yes, our school is unique. It looks like no other in the country. And over the past few years, I've stopped trying to fit into what our school should look like and embrace what it is that we do exceptionally well. We flipped the model. Our head of school and principals are our soccer coaches. Our admissions criteria looks for hardworking kids who never give up and can't read. We value community over the individual, and we'll do whatever it takes to get to the finish line. We're a zero tuition school for students whose average household income is $26,000. We don't have an operating reserve, and we don't have a capital reserve. In fact, we rent a church building that has some interesting plumbing issues. We have a moral obligation to give every kid in this country a quality education. We shouldn't have 8th graders who cannot read even though they've been in our school system for 7 years. We shouldn't have kids who don't love going to school and learning, and we shouldn't have the gap between the haves and have-nots get even bigger than it is. Every child should have the choice to go to whatever school serves them best, regardless of income. Quality schools that meet their community needs should be available to everyone. The Fugees are strong, capable, resilient, and have defied the odds. Every study, every piece of data says that they shouldn't graduate, that they should never complete high school, that they will live in poverty for generations. They do the impossible. They embody everything that makes this country great. I'm nearly finished. All of us here are privileged. By virtue of being in this room, we are privileged. We are safe. We are not starving. Our homes are not being bombed. We can read and we can write. We either have a college degree or 3 or 4. In one way or another, we all shape future generations of learners. And with that, we are even more privileged. With that comes the burden of responsibility. Do not limit your definition of student success to be solely academic. Expand it to include every aspect of a child's development. Invest deeply into models that look like nothing you've ever seen before. Do not impose your own values on others. Expect for all children what you would for your own. And always believe that you can make this world a better, safer, kinder, and more just place. Thank you.
I'm still processing the emotional and visceral images that I have from the words of the students that you shared with us, Luma. We're very privileged, all of us, to have this opportunity this morning to hear from both Junlei and Luma, and I'm very eager to dive into a conversation to unpack some of the implications for all of us. Let's give our speakers one more round of acknowledgement. Thank you. So much to unpack and share and discuss, and so little time. So let me dive right into a number of topics and hopefully start the conversation, and we'll let it go wherever. Now, my charge, by the way, is to provoke a rigorous conversation to get us thinking about different ways of serving and supporting our children. So one thing I will note for the audience is that all three of us are immigrants to this country. A lot of personal stories about cultural connections and disconnections, as well as linguistic barriers and challenges that surfaces from our own struggles to acculturate in this country and in the service of education. It is also interesting to note that we all came to this country for education and better opportunities, and all of us are or were, I still am, English learners, constantly learning the language, the nuances, and the implications of social and cultural context. Thinking about that for our children and the powerful work that both Junlei and Luma has described that is cross-cultural and linguistically diverse. So one of the thoughts that I wanted to build on is really to suggest that either one of you can start to share that perspective and lens from both your personal experiences, but also the work across cultural lens for the important human interactions that are not dependent on linguistic common language or necessarily common culture and history. So I know you talked quite a bit about the international work starting in China, and of course, Luma, your students are from all over the world, war-torn countries in particular. How do you help? What are those practices from your observations? The powerful connections that you talk about is so important for all of our children.
I think there's something universal about what it means to be a helper to children, or just to be a helper, period. When you watch just 30 seconds of an interaction halfway around the globe, long before you start to take out a measurement instrument, there's something that clicks with you. Right? So when you watch the video, I watch you, long before you laugh, most of you smile, right? So what is it that makes you smile? There's something that's deeply resonating, and if somehow our work with children as well as children's helpers can give voice and affirmation and recognition to these universally human elements. One of the lessons I learned from Mr. Rogers is that as much as he honored and presented diversity on the neighborhood television program, one of the things he would always say is that we are much more alike than we're different. And when it comes to helping children, when it comes to the needs of children, I think the world around, we're just much more alike than we're different.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to jump on that part. We try to find what the children have in common, because we have kids from over 25 different countries, multiple languages spoken, and so our first hook is through soccer, using the universal language of a sport that they all love, that they all understand, that they all had positive memories of. And then there is something very powerful about all sharing a common identity. All our students have fled war. And we have kids from warring factions playing on the same team, and what brings them together is they want to win, and you can't win if you don't get along. and you don't understand each other and you don't respect each other. And so that deep work of peeling off those layers of why do we hate each other? Why do we not understand each other? Why did those wars start? And then finding that we are more alike than different.
So you're suggesting some particular strategies for helpers or the adults in the environment. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit more on, particularly with the older students, how do they connect with each other? How do we help them understand the commonalities and the universal experiences that they come with, and building on that?
I mean, a lot of it is we tend to celebrate everything. So everything from, you know, we have a big Thanksgiving celebration with a Fugees idol component of it, to celebrating Holi and Eid and Christmas and every cultural holiday that there is. A lot of people that work for us say it's like one big party most of the year because every other week there's a celebration. And we want our students to be proud of who they are. The older students tend to bond a lot on what their immigrant or refugee parents have in common. So I don't know how many of you here have parents that were not born here, but like the idea of a sleepover is a no-no. My daughter's already trying to negotiate a sleepover with me, and I'm like, you don't know these people. You're not going there unless I have their social security number. And so a lot of our kids have the same thing. Is like their parents will, like when we do an overnight soccer tournament, I have to like go every year to the same parents and explain what we're going to be doing. And so they talk about it. Sometimes they make fun of it, but there's that understanding that yes, you know, our parents are all the same. And then to teach our kids how to navigate, you know, being Americans and being, you know, Sudanese or Iraqi or Nepali, because those two identities have to come together for them to be whole. You can't have one here and one here without them integrating. And you can't reject one or the other. And we talk a lot about that, and we practice that a lot.
So initially, when they don't have the common language, a lot of the universal observations that you are suggesting for the adults to be aware of, how do you help children actually value and understand that there is more than one identity, and it's an additive process, not a negation? So I'm going to lead to the question really of, given what you both have just suggested on building on commonalities and the strengths of our students, what are those challenges for the adults trying to do that without taking away historical experiences and cultural norms and values that may be in conflict with what we consider mainstream American identity? So how do we help our children navigate those, especially when they don't have that common language or understanding initially? How do we develop that?
I think I'm thinking of a specific context where we work in a residential boys' ranch in Canada, and half of the children are First People from that region, and a lot of the youth workers there couldn't identify with the challenges of that experience. But one of the things that what we find is that the youth staff let go what I would think are what sometimes in research called prescriptive goals, or goals that says, I'm here to change your life. That they shift their professional thinking into what they call the small wins. And they said that if they had focused on the big transformative changes day in and day out, they wouldn't be able to survive the 2 steps forward and 3 steps back nature of the work. But that if they're able to focus their sight on the small wins, the kind of things that happen not in the flashy kind of under the spotlight moment, but in the most ordinary and mundane interactions they have with the children, that keeps them going.
And that sense of belonging that both of you touched on, feeling included in the community identity. I know that was one aspect of my initial arrival as a newcomer of continuously struggling with what the primary culture at home demanded and a conflict with what school demands were. For example, a respectful child is valued as somebody who is seen and not heard. And yet, in the school situation, if you don't participate and you're not actively engaged in the classroom, there is a penalty. In fact, many of the classes I took required a grading system that includes how well you participated and contributed in class. And there was a very difficult balance from a child's perspective on how do I behave in one manner that is valued at home and yet it's penalized in a different environment. And so those are the kind of challenges that I would think that many of our children, newcomers to this country, find themselves in that kind of a conflicting situation.
I think you have to bring it both a little closer so they're not so far apart. And you have to allow the students to make mistakes, and you have to educate your staff around what things may be different. So one of the things, a lot of our students don't make eye contact when they're speaking to an adult,
Right.
because that's considered disrespectful, it's considered challenging. In the United States, if you don't make eye contact, it's considered shady, dishonest. And so we explain that to our teachers during orientation, and then with our students, we try to get them to do the gaze closer to the eye. So maybe not direct eye contact. I was like, but you cannot look down when you're speaking to a teacher, because they're gonna think you're lying or not being honest. And so bring it a little bit closer. We had an issue last year where my math teacher came in, and he's African American, and he was really upset. And he said one of the students in our school is not identifying as black. And some of the comments he's making were interpreted to be racist. And this student is from North Sudan. And I was like, I was confused for a little bit, and I said, well, in North Sudan, he's not black. He's Arab. He's considered, North Sudan is considered Arab. The racial constructs that we have in the United States are not what we have abroad. But we still have a problem, because he lives in the United States, and he is perceived as a black man. And so we had to have the conversation with the students. And when he understood, when the teacher understood where the student was coming from, and when the student understood that gap was missing for the teacher, their connection became deeper. And now they trust each other more, and they work with each other more, and they can have these honest conversations that people, I think, are too scared to have. But you have to try and bring both closer, and at some point they will mesh
So it's
more.
working both with the adult's perspective, at the same time working with the student and their perspective on that interaction. So you both talk a lot in your description of efforts to support students in a humanistic, emphasizing interactions and relationship. And in both of your description, and particularly, Luma, with your situation, you highlight a lot of the work that is outside the school system, how you make those connections that is outside the four walls of the classroom, which leads me to wonder about how our school systems are currently structured and whether or not we need to spend more time, both resources and attention, to what is happening outside of the schoolhouse rather than our primary focus on academic learning as defined very narrowly in many cases. But the whole learner definition that is far more encompassing than just the schoolhouse, right? So my question then is, should we think about the primary work for supporting student human relations development should actually be happening outside of the school environment? More attention, more support, and maybe not worry so much about what's happening within the school. And you brought up a great example of school not being structured to meet the needs of students. We're expecting students to come in and fit themselves into a system regardless of what their needs are and where they're coming from. And if we're going to reverse that, then help us think about the current structure of schools and how significant is that in informing, and encompassing what we know is the most significant. If that's the active ingredient, Junlei, then is school the right place or the best place? I know that's a little bit of a rhetorical question in a way, but I'm actually very serious, coming from many decades of work in school systems, both from local, state, and district perspective. Are we putting too much emphasis and our expectations for what school can deliver? Is that realistic or appropriate even, given where we are right now? That you had to create a whole new system, for example, in order to meet the needs of kids. So how do you think about the possibilities? What do we need to do differently to really look at inclusion and equity in a meaningful way? And I'm suggesting to think about our structures right now. That seems to be a challenge and a barrier. And we're spending a lot of time, we're in the midst of another pivot. National education reform with lots of promises, opportunities, but challenges as we implement this year across the country the Every Child Succeeds Act, right? Success for Every Child. Student success, ESSA, ESAA. So what is that opportunity for us to think differently beyond the four walls of the classroom?
I think one of the things I find hopeful whenever I think of kind of entrenched structures that are very hard to change, sometimes I think people refer to the walls as the grammar of school. So you can change the equipment of the school, but the basic grammar of the school doesn't change. What I have found hopeful is that in many of the settings we have worked in that have these walls, that have these almost unchangeable structures, we have observed and have seen helpers who don't have the luxury to just walk outside that wall, but somehow they manage to do it within the walls and change what they can. And in Pittsburgh, I had the opportunity for several years to follow a group of teachers in a project called Children's Innovation Project. That happens in one of those low-income, almost segregated neighborhoods. And these teachers, their motto, which I loved, they said, innovation is finding something new inside something known. And that was really striking to me, that so often when we think about investing in innovation, we think about let's go get the next big shiny object and put it inside the walls. But everywhere I see that it is possible to find a certain level of innovation inside the known practices that already exists. And that has always been there, that the helpers have always creatively, sometimes subversively, work within the walls and trying to create what they think is right for the children. And if we can devote resources and give attention to that, that is the beginning of a seed of hope in transforming the system.
So I certainly have seen those kinds of situations and experiences where people have subversively do what's best and right for kids, despite the structure of the system. But I think Luma gave us a great example of the current system. And I think at one point you had talked about either not caring or not knowing how to work with particularly refugee students in our current system.
I think refugee students highlight everything that's wrong with our system.
Right.
Because we try the one size fits all, we try the same model for every single person. And it's like every innovation in technology was designed for an extreme. So like our iPhone, my 4 and 3-year-old know how to use it. They know how to play with it. There are things they can do that I don't know how to do. And then I use it for a different use. But it was designed so simply that they could use it. Mm-hmm. And I believe education needs to embrace that model, that if we can design a school that is successful with the most vulnerable students, then those practices and those systems will provide it for all students. And I'm biased. I think refugee students just highlight that with everything that they're coming with and not coming with, and how does that work? And we have to expand what a classroom looks like and what it does. Yes, there are times where you have to learn how to read, you have to learn how to add, but it's not going to happen overnight. And we have to be more patient, and we have to be more caring that each child develops differently. And this approach everyone the same, or also trying to think that a computer can fix it, some type of technology is going to miraculously allow a student to read right away. Like, that's not going to happen. And we have to be a little bit more patient with how long some of this takes. Like with us, I've done this for 10 years. I have 10 years of data, and they're all over the place. Some students, it's like upward trajectory. Others, it's like a little bit and then down and then up, and then, you know, as long as it's headed in the right direction at a decent pace, but they're all different, and you have to embrace that.
So is there a mechanism built into what you're doing right now with your new school coming on board as well that allows the rest of the country's school system to learn how to incorporate or utilize some of the lessons you've learned and the strategies to effectively work with refugee students or any group of students that we are underserving?
I mean, I think some of the strategies we use, so like every child in school plays soccer. You know, it's not just a select group of kids. Every child participates in Fugees Idol. Every child eats lunch together. We provide lunch for everyone. And so it's about making sure all the students are seen and heard, and that there is equal access to everything. I find that a lot of schools create programs for the elite. So here's band, or here's drama club. But I don't know about you guys, but like in middle school, we had to participate in everything. Mm-hmm. And there's value to participating in everything, because if you're not an athlete, then your highlight may be the school play or something else. And you know, I've gotten into discussions with some of my teachers, you know, when some students don't want to eat lunch, and they're like, you know, let's go make them another sandwich, let's go. And I said, but we have a really good lunch, and it's for everyone. And some of the reasons we do it is we have a parent cook it, so the food is what they're used to and what they value and what they love. And then another reason is we don't want some kids to feel like they have or don't have resources at home, that everybody is equal in that building. You know, we provide school uniforms and athletic equipment for everyone without making the ask, well, you have some so you can pay, or you don't have any. It's like, don't put kids in that position. Treat them all equally.
How many schools or the district that did not go through with the contracting with you, have they come back to visit with you and ask, well, how are you doing this? Any schools, any interest across the country as they learn about your work?
Not yet.
Okay. We're going to work on that, so we need to spread the word here. I'm going to shift to a very timely topic as well, as all of us are in the throes of really grappling across the country the whole question of teaching as a profession and the critical shortages in the pipeline for teachers. That varies from region to region. It's more of a crisis in certain regions of the country than others. But what is commonly found is that we have shortages, particularly for educators of early childhood, as well as English learners. So we talk a lot about, well, what does it mean to identify a strong, effective what is quality teaching? What is a quality program? You talk a lot about the adult as a caregiver, which many teachers do see themselves doing. But a couple of questions around this that are relevant to our discussion. The diminishing status of teaching as a profession for a lot of different reasons. What about teacher preparation programs? What about licensure and certification requirements? And how do we retain strong teachers, quality teachers, effective teachers in our classroom? But that also demands some kind of common definition of what is quality, what is effective. So I'm wondering, how do you see it? What do you look for when you're hiring faculty? For example, Junlei, you do a lot of professional development in pre-service and in-service work with caregivers. What are those attributes that you would suggest that we really need to pay attention to, and maybe not paying adequate attention as well? And perhaps some barriers. Are we looking at the right attributes? It would be very helpful because I have a board report due after a year-long study in Illinois that's going to the board tomorrow. And those are actually the 4 categories that we've been grappling with across the state, and very, very relevant to the whole discussion of the middle. And if we don't have adults who are entering this profession to care for our children, then what? Or the right adults, I should say.
I think when it comes to this discussion of profession, who is a professional and how do we count them? I wonder if we can try to keep it simple without being simplistic. And what I mean by simplistic is, for example, if the conversation focuses entirely on whether someone have a paper that has a credential on it, that is simplistic. And it's also exclusive. There are so many educators, particularly those who help children, educate children in low resource settings. They themselves have extremely limited access to these things. And that by defining professions solely by a credential on a piece of paper, we exclude the vast majority of those helpers who are actually helping children where they are. At the same time, I think it's possible to be much, much simpler in thinking about all of that. And I think of, in the example earlier, I think of the farmers in that village whose education stopped usually around 8th grade. So when they become foster parents for these children with cerebral palsy, right, they don't even know what cerebral palsy is. But they figured it out little by little. Now, I don't mean there's magic. There's a lot of tough work day in and day out. But they had 2 things. One is that they were given the opportunity and time to be with the children, to gradually figure it out. And the other thing that they had in the little village in China that many of our teachers don't have here in the most developed country in the world is a community of practice. That in the village, right, if you couldn't figure something out with your child with cerebral palsy, your neighbor also has one. And you kind of figure it out with each other within that community of practice. And so often in the institutionalized professional world, we actually lose the very thing that has driven not just the work of early childhood, but has driven the work of every area of human community in terms of growing practice.
How do you identify, recruit, select staff for your schools?
We've had to think more creatively about our pipeline. I believe very strongly that a portion of our staff needs to, and leadership needs to reflect the population that we serve. But I remember a few years ago, my COO sent me the resume of a math teacher, and he's a military vet, and I did not want to interview him. I was like, this is someone who condones war. I am not, nope. And Nikki pushed me on it. She's like, I just spoke to him. I think you two are very much alike in so many ways. Just meet with him. Just do me a favor and meet with him. And so I met with him. And an hour and a half later, and my interviews usually last 30 minutes. I don't have the, I think, attention span for an hour and a half. We talked everything from immigration, education policy to tough love. And he knew where the kids were coming from. He had been to a lot of the countries that they had fled. And we also ask, one of the questions we ask in an interview is, tell me about a point in your life where you have struggled, a time where you've hit rock bottom, and how you got out of it, if you did. And we look first for what people will define as a struggle. So this past spring, someone defined a struggle as getting a C in college. And I was like, oh dear, if they think that is a struggle, we've got a big disconnect. So that person obviously did not make it to the next round. And then we look for who do they lean on? Do they have a support network, whether it's family, whether it's friends, whether it's something inside that they know it will always get better, because they have to be able to do that for all our children. And then another thing we do is a lot of people attracted to this work have a savior complex. And for us, it's about giving our students the tools so that they don't need us anymore. And so in the sample class, we plant a student to write the wrong answer or give the wrong answer. And then we see how that teacher reacts. And we did this because when we were doing a sample class, we'd interviewed this math teacher, and after class, I was like, so guys, what do you think? I thought he was pretty good. And one of the kids like, Coach, you can't hire him. He thinks we're stupid. And I was like, whoa, what did I miss? Because I was in the room, I'd listened to everything. And he had put the wrong answer down intentionally. And this teacher had looked at it and said, good job, good job.
Oh, wow. That's
And we don't want those teachers. We don't
Very
want those
pointy.
teachers who are not going to push our. So now we plant it. So please don't share it, because we're going to be hiring a lot of people. But it's like we've had to change the way we interview and the way we look at things to find people that are more aligned with our values. Because if you're not aligned, it's just never going to work out.
And it ultimately comes back to those values and the emotional impact and leadership with strong commitment to serving our students where they are instead of imposing. I am shocked that we're at time, but if we can take just the next couple of minutes for each of you to share at least one major thought that you would like this audience to walk away with, and then think about that is significant and to you and to the work that we all do. Like to start with you, Junlei, if you could just share, in the next minute or two, and then Luma also.
Sure. I think we're here because we are committed for this particular conference to help support the whole child. And all of us rely on helpers on the front line to do that. And I don't think there's a way to support the whole child without seeing and advocating for the wholeness of the helpers. And I think there are at least two paths by which we can all go about doing that, because we are the helpers to the helpers. One is by being a helpful critic, to push against the system, to push against the walls, to push for a structure and an institution, as well as outside institutions, where helpers can actually be themselves and do the work. But the other path that's equally important and complementary, and sometimes are less taken for those who have the privilege of power, and that is to be a helpful appreciator. To be able to see a helper, see the difficulty of their circumstances, be able to find something whole in what they are doing, to acknowledge that, affirm that, and reflect that back to the person in whatever way, shape, or form we can do it. From a grant to a conversation, everything we do communicates a message to those on the front line.
Thank you, Junlei. That has implications for not just learning, but what we need to unlearn in our daily practice.
I think I always like to say that fundraising is like dating. You go out, you see if you guys click, if you're aligned, and then you see if you want to go on a second date or a third, and eventually, hopefully, you never want to be mutually exclusive in grant making, not in dating. But what I'm trying to say is that relationship needs to be equal. The power dynamic, and I said it in my talk, that to please not impose your own values or theories on what the practitioners are doing, that trust that you are investing in them, and that's not saying don't expose them to professional development and ideas, but I have been in several situations where I've been told what to do, and it would compromise what we do and how we do it, and ultimately compromise our integrity with our students and their families. And we've had to walk away in those situations. And the funders we work best with is when that relationship is equal. And so I urge you, when you are looking at people to invest in, to make sure that you are truly supporting them and helping them and not creating more layers of work or telling them, hey, run this program or do this, but to have it more equal, because that's what we want in partnerships. We want equal partners.
Nice way to conclude. I want to thank both Junlei and Luma for their insightful conversation this morning and their presentations. It gives us real optimism and confidence in serving our children in the future, but more importantly, I think what they both represent and reflect today is truly modeling the values of serving children. So once again, let's give them a great thank you and appreciation. Thank you so much for the work that you both do.
You can just stay there. I'm going to speak very briefly.
Okay.
Thank you. So, I hope that you were able to grasp the theme and the topic that you're going to be involved in for the next 3 days. I would also ask you to exemplify some of the things that you heard that we were looking for as helpers of helpers, in some cases helpers of helpers of helpers, of learners of all ages. So in that, please carefully look at the app that will help you decide where you want to go next. Choose carefully. There's a lot to pick from. And then let's keep that spirit not only of looking at the whole learner, but consider yourselves as the learner and make sure that we're nurturing each other and looking at the whole. So I will ask you, as I do every time, and especially as this is a big milestone for me, and this is my 6th Grantmakers for Education conference, and my last one in this role, I'm just going to ask you to please spend the next 3 days with an open mind and a smile. And with that, one last round of applause for our great speakers.